Hello and welcome back. We, I believe, left off on this slide. I'm going to run it back yeah, we were talking about measuring um, the difference between overt and covert attention and how looking at eye movements might be a window onto overt attention. But we also had raised the idea that sometimes we can be attending to things uh, in a way that is not so overt. Um, and so maybe one example, I got a few laboratory examples here, but once, I guess this is kind of like out of a movie, right? Let's imagine we're a spy, right? So you're in the CIA, you're following somebody, but you don't want them to know that you're following them or that you're watching them or spying on them, right? So you're going to maintain some sort of a safe distance, and you're going to pretend that you're reading a book or looking at your phone or whatever it might be, but you're going to be secretly kind of watching them out of the corner of your eye, taking photographs or something. And so, but you don't want that to be overt. You want it to be covert, right? So that's a form of covert attention, but not exactly the sort of thing we may do in everyday life, unless you're being a little weird. So let's not do that, right? But let's look at some laboratory examples of covert attention here. First example is this idea of a masking stimulus here. So this is not this example is a little weird compared to my real world example of covert attention, because this is not the same thing of trying to hide your attentional targets, right? So a mask in this case is a technique in this kind of research, in attention and vision research, where you can present a stimulus on a screen and you're going to flash it for a brief period of time. And then it's only there for a brief period of time, and then it's replaced by a different image. That's usually just sort of like a bunch of random dots on a screen, right? And that image of the random dots is the mask. And what happens is that when you are shown this very, very rapid flash of an image that is quickly followed by the mask, what happens is that our attention really struggles to keep up with that first image, and we end up paying much more attention to the mask, which of course is there's nothing there to see other than a bunch of random dots on the screen. So oftentimes people, I got P here. P is my abbreviation for our participant in the research study here. Uh, Oftentimes, people will struggle to provide any exact details about what was present in the scene, right? If I were to say, can you give me a list? This could have been a photograph of a kitchen, right? But if I asked them to give me a list of details such as where was the refrigerator? Was it on the left or was it on the right? What color was it? Where, all of these sorts of things. Were there any pots on the stove, right? Any of these kinds of details, they simply cannot tell you anything about that. They're just like, I don't know. So they really had no overt, clear, obvious attention to the scene. But at the same time, if we simply just ask them, is there anything you could say about it? They can say, well, it was a kitchen, right? Or it was an office. I just can't give you any specifics. So that would suggest that something has been attended here, but it's really at a very broad level, and there's no sort of conscious overt attention being involved in that. That's one example of a type of covert attention. Something gets processed without really us directly aware that we're doing it, right? This is similar here is this other task, and this one's a little bit, maybe a little more straightforward. So what we're going to have people do is we're going to have people do this is called a visual search task, where you're searching for a letter. So I have a couple of sample stimuli on the side of the slide here. So in one example, we have a screen full of the letter P, except one of them is the letter B, right? So your task is simply to just scan this to report, is one of these letters different or are they all the same? And you can press a button, same or different, right? So there's one oddball there, press the button, otherwise press a different button. This can be made a little easier. So the second example, you see there's fewer P's there as service distractors, so it's easier maybe to find the B there. It's not hiding like it is in the top image. But what's also happening is that while you're doing this and you're sitting right at a computer screen and you're looking at it and trying to make these judgments, the researchers will place a second screen over here to your side, right? And all that they're going to do is that while you're looking at these letters, doing the letter search task, there's going to be various images flashing on the screen to your side. You're not supposed to look at them. You're just, it's just there, right? It's not part of the task at all. But then later, we're going to ask people a question. Can you tell me anything about what that image was over there in the periphery? Like maybe was there an animal in the image or anything like that? And people, as you see the statistic here, are getting about 3/4 of these questions correct, which does suggest that even though their overt attention was on the task in front of them, there must have been some covert attention on that imagery in the side. So that suggests that even when we're not directly, directing all of our attentional resources at something, a few things are still leaking through, right? Another example of covert attention are what are called look but failed to see accidents. I think I might have said something about this at the end of the previous video. I have a separate slide on this coming up, so let's hold the phone until we get there. Now, another example related to kind of differences between overt and covert attention. This is called inattentional blindness, and this in a way almost gives us an opposite result from the previous experiment that I described where people are engaged in the letter search task. And so therefore in that task, while their overt attention is on the letter search task, covert attention is still allowing some background information to come in anyway. What the inattentional blindness studies demonstrate is exactly the opposite, that our covert attention sometimes can be so strong, overt attention. So our overt attention can be so strong that we fail to notice certain things that might be right in the middle of our field of view. And this does in fact mirror the concept of looked but failed to see. Now you might have seen this video before. I'm going to go ahead and hit play. Oh, great. We get usually embedding videos blocks ads. Okay. Turn down the audio on this as well. So count how many times the player is wearing white past the basketball is the instruction. So we got these three people here, so we're just going to watch them, and they're passing the ball back and forth. So we are counting how often they do that. Now, as I've mentioned, you may have seen this before, so you know what happens here, but otherwise, let's say you have never seen this. So let's just keep going, and we're going to watch and count. And don't listen to me while that's all happening, right? I'm going to pause it right there. So, where are we? How many passes were there? The answer is nobody cares. That's not the point of the task, right? Let me reverse it back here to the somewhere in the middle. Right there we go. Let's get it to right about here. Yep, right there. Well, so you might notice that we have what we have here. We've got a person in a gorilla suit walking into the middle of the scene and beats on his chest and then walks out. And because the gorilla's wearing black, we're not looking at anybody wearing black, right? That's the instruction, is to only count the passes by the people wearing the white t-shirts. So we're just ignoring anything that's black because we've got these other people wearing black t-shirts. And as you then understand, that causes us to completely miss the person in the gorilla suit. So that means that because our attention is not directed at it, we are blind to it, right? But importantly, your eyes must have fell upon the gorilla at some point while watching the video, right? So your eyes must have pointed right at it, but you just didn't process that, right? So that's why we're going to call that inattentional blindness. Granted, of course, something else is going on here, because you could easily imagine that if we took out our other actors wearing black t-shirts throwing the basketball around, that they would that this effect would disappear, right? So simply just watching the people in white Playing basketball is not going to prevent us from seeing the person in the gorilla suit. But what has to happen is that we are training our attentional systems to ignore the people wearing black. Fair question to ask, for example, if we wanted to do some variations on this, is you notice that the people wearing white t-shirts are generally wearing light colored pants, jeans, but the people wearing black t-shirts are head to toe black, right? Black pants, black shirts. So what if we changed that up a little bit and gave them the black t-shirts, but let them wear light colored jeans like the other people wearing the white shirts? Would we still fail to see the gorilla, or would they suddenly stand out, right? So this, what would this be? What would be the purpose of this? The purpose might be to understand what kind of attentional filtering is happening, and what is it ignoring, right? Because we're kind of training our attentional filters to block out something. And it could be just anything that has any black on it, or it might be something that's black but of a certain scale from head to toe, right? And those kinds of variations might teach us a thing or two more about all of that. But again, it's another example here of look but fail to see. So as I mentioned, I did have another slide on this. Look but fail to see shows up in driving. And this is something where we might be especially concerned. As I've described already in talking about divided attention, the driving task is inherently a divided attention task. We are simultaneously engaging in lane maintenance and speed maintenance and monitoring for all kinds of other things going on. And when we add in cell phones, then that becomes one more uh, task in the divided attention situation here. And what we know from the statistics, these are statistics that comes from things like the National Transportation and Safety Bureau, that people who are driving while distracted are 4 times more likely to be involved in a crash. And by distraction here, I mean the cell phone. There are other forms of distraction, which is important to note, but we'll leave it here to the classic Strayer and Johnston studies. So one of the things that comes up with cell phones and driving is what kind of distraction are we talking about here? Is it a visual distraction? Is it because I'm use my actual phone here as a prop? Is it because I stopped to look at my phone? And because I'm looking at my phone and therefore my eyes are not where they're supposed to be, right? I should be looking at the road, or I should be looking at my dashboard, or I should be looking in the mirrors. I should be looking at anything that's driving related, right? A task that's task positive for the driving task. And the phone is clearly not, right? But again, of course, that kind of looking measure is a measure of overt attention. We could use eye tracking to determine what people are looking at, right? So, is it possible that that's the issue? Is that the culprit? Certainly, we don't want to look away from the roadway and all the task relevant stimuli. But at the same time, some of the previous studies we have found suggested that maybe we can still process information from our periphery anyway. So maybe the visual distraction doesn't matter a lot. Or what we also see is in the inattentional blindness study, sometimes we can look directly at something and not see it. So is the visual part even critical here? There's the other issue here is of a kind of a motoric, right? And what I mean here is the fact that you're using your hands, right? And so normally we use our hands to steer the car. We need to keep our hands on the controls of the car. But if I take a hand away and use it to hold the phone, and I'm holding and manipulating and doing things with it, then of course that's going to possibly be a distraction. Or it could be a third possibility where it's more of an internal kind of attentional state where it's that spotlight of attention, right? It's not about where my eyes are pointed. It's not about what my hands are doing, but rather it's merely about the fact that my spotlight of attention is now being shone upon the incoming signal of the cell phone, the conversation that I'm having with the person through the phone. So Strayer and Johnston were able to evaluate these hypotheses. So they have a condition where they put people in a driving simulator. They give them a handheld phone, right? So you're going to put the phone up to your head and you're going to drive in your driving simulator while having a phone conversation with somebody. So they're going to have a research assistant in another room who you call during the driving simulator task. And they talk like that. And then they're going to measure some of their driving errors, right? They're going to measure how effectively do they stay in their lane or do they start to weave. We're going to measure their response times to brake lights of other cars or other traffic signals, right? All these are performance measures of distraction. Then there's a hands-free version, right? So the hands-free version, you put your phone on a little cradle, and again, you have the same kind of conversation with a person who's in another room. And then just to also incorporate the concept of just being exposed to any kind of auditory stimulus, they had people listening to music. And what we find is that the music condition, well, it's maybe not perfect. I wouldn't say that it's never distracting, but it doesn't really result in a lot of significant distraction here. But I have a little bit more to say about listening to music while driving a little deeper into the notes. But what they found is that the number of performance-related measures of distraction, as I described them, were about equal between the handheld and hand-free versions of these experiments here. This would suggest then that freeing up your hand really doesn't make a big difference. Now, this experiment didn't really address the visual side of things very much because in either case, they don't have to spend a lot of time looking at their phone. But what the point of this here is to show that the nature of the distraction comes from the fact that you're just having a conversation, right? Which is a very demanding kind of cognitive activity that requires more attention on the conversational task. And that's going to take us away from the driving task. And that's what causes the distraction. Somewhat ironically is that once many states started to develop laws regarding cell phone use and driving, many states adopted laws that banned handheld phone conversations, but allowed hands-free phone conversation. What these studies like this, and this has been replicated, it's not just the one, but this is one of the main original findings here, is that it doesn't really matter, right? The hands-free version of a cell phone conversation doesn't really save you from distraction, right? Doesn't make it any safer. Now you might be thinking, well, if the conversation is the thing that's distracting you, then wouldn't that mean that passengers are distracting? And the answer, well, there's nuance here because in some cases, what we find is no, the passenger is not distracting, but that's because the passenger is there with you. And that means that if the driving situation is pretty, undemanding, you're on an open highway, you don't have to do a lot, then you might be having a conversation. But on the other hand, if you are in a situation where the driving suddenly becomes very intensive, right? You're on a busy roadway during rush hour and lots of stop and go and everything. What we find is that oftentimes passengers naturally modulate their conversation, right? They know when it's time to just shut up and stop talking because that the driver needs to concentrate a little bit more, right? So they will kind of naturally respond to these dynamics. Curiously, if the person in the car is unaware of the driving situation, like we can do this in the laboratory just by blindfolding them, putting them in a driving simulator, but the passenger is blindfolded, so they don't know about any kind of changes to the driving environment. Then, of course, they never modulate their conversation, and we can show evidence that they do become distracting at that point. Another example, though, are children in the back seat of a car, because children don't know anything about the driving dynamics, and when they want attention, they just demand attention, and children can be very distracting of parents who are driving cars. And sometimes, if you have a whole bunch of people in the car and there's people talking, it's just inherently distracting, even if they are modulating a little bit, right? So, and of course, none of that even addresses some of the more recent changes to in-car technology. In 2001, when Strayer and Johnston did this, cell phones were essentially little push button phones, right? Now we have screens that require us to look at it while we're touching it, right? You can't feel your way around the buttons anymore. You have to look at what you're doing. And people, of course, social media and texting wasn't as big then. So now people are maybe increasingly likely to stream video while they're driving or to scroll on social media while they're driving. Horrifying to think about because that's perhaps even more visually, physically, and attentionally distracting. And that doesn't even address the increasing use of in-car technologies, right? Many modern cars have large touch screens in the center console that we have to look at and touch just to change the climate controls, perhaps. And that's a potentially problematic issue as well. But before, rather than going down the continued rabbit hole, let's move on here a little bit here. So what we're kind of seeing with this divided attention finding is that we do have some capacity limits here. There's a limit to how many different things we can do. And driving seems to be something that most people can do. It is a divided attention task, but the total number of components are pretty reasonable. But once we start throwing in these additional tasks, all right, maybe we can still process a little in the periphery. We can still have a little covert attention. I can maybe do okay. I'm talking on a phone and I'm still driving. And as long as the task isn't too difficult, everything's going to be okay. I'm probably going to process less information from the driving task. I'm going to be a little slower. But if it's low demand, maybe I don't have an accident, right? But as soon as the demands go up, accident risk goes up as well, right? And of course, this varies from person to person. So don't overgeneralize from what I'm saying and suggesting that sometimes it can be safe to drive and talk on your phone, because most likely, no, it's not. But the getting at the deeper theoretical issue is the idea that what we want to know here is what's going on with the capacity itself, and what can we do to understand what our capacity is, and what are the factors that either increase or decrease. I don't want to say capacity. It might be the case that the capacity is fixed, right, in terms of how much we can do, but some tasks are maybe more demanding and others are less demanding. So a more demanding task uses more of the capacity versus a less demanding task uses less of it. So if we can find a way to create an index of the attentional demand or load, that would be an interesting thing to try to do, because then what we're going to do is figure out how can we predict when people are likely to hit those limits. Now, we're not going to keep completely go that way, right? But what we are going to do is we're going to look a little bit more at issues of selective attention and how we direct our attention towards different things in the environment, and how we can effectively search and scan our environment for information. And once again, we have a task here that is a bit of an odd task, and it doesn't seem to have any obvious connection to real world examples of attention, but we're going to try to make this connection a little bit. So this is an example of one way to think about that difference between covert and overt attention that I've been going through here is that sometimes overt attention is what we'll call voluntary, right? I am choosing to direct my attention at this thing or that thing or another thing. But meanwhile, there's certain things happening in the periphery that are part of my covert attention, and they're still leaking in, right? And I still am processing that a little bit here, right? So when we can try to explore this a little bit by looking at this task, which involves a little bit of voluntary and involuntary attentional influences on our performance here. But I've also added a note here that voluntary processes might be considered more top-down. They're driven by knowledge, whereas involuntary attentional effects might be more bottom-up. That is, there's just some sort of external stimulus that captures our attention, grabs our attention, right? We've talked about the top-down and bottom-up influences earlier. So let's talk about what the Posner task is all about here. So it's called the Posner queuing task, and what's happening here is that you are just looking at a screen, and you're going to see this little gray rectangle. So if you can follow the little flow chart here, this is what it looks like at time 1. You see 2 white boxes, and in the center, there's a little white dot that you have to look at. Keep your eyes fixed there. And then what's going to happen is at some point in time, there will be a little arrow that appears pointing to the left, and in which case it is soon followed by an X that appears in the left box. And your task is really simple. As soon as the X appears, press a button. So this is basically a reaction time task. And what we have done by placing this little arrow that shows up just in advance of the X, we have pre-queued you to respond to the X, right? We have given you a hint. It's going to be over here on the left. So you can go ahead and move your eyes over there and prepare to respond. So when I talked about pre-queuing as a way of speeding up reaction times earlier in the notes, this is a straightforward example of that, right? So your task is to press the button whenever an X appears. You don't know whether the X is going to be on the left or the right, but if we show you this arrow in advance, then you get a chance to prepare and look in the right direction ahead of time. You're going to be responding a whole lot faster. You might also notice that on the right hand, though, we do have an occasional situation where we can make the cue invalid. So the arrow points to the right, but the target actually appears to the left. And you would expect the obvious thing to happen here, which is that now people's reaction time's a little bit slower, right? But now let's look at this other case. So these arrows, my light keeps turning off here. These arrows are called endogenous cues. Weird choice of word, but we might call it a central cue because the arrow here appears right in the center of your field of view. The exogenous cues or the external cues are the ones where the box, instead of an arrow appearing that points you one way or another, now a box just lights up, right? So the box might just flash with a red outline. And we can have a valid cue, right? So the box on the left flashes and then the X appears there. Or we can have the invalid version where the box on the right flashes, but then it appears to the left, right? So what we find here is that both of these cues work to speed up reaction time. But what's kind of important here is what's referred to as the interstimulus interval, or ISI for short. And so this is the interval between the appearance of the cue and the appearance of the target X. And when it is pretty brief, 100 or 300 milliseconds, we get our best effects here. But one of the things that we find is that if there's a longer delay, like beyond 300 milliseconds, upwards of even 500 milliseconds, as I've written here, then what happens is that if the box flashes and then you kind of look over there for 100, 200, 300 milliseconds, we're talking here, 300 milliseconds is about a third of a second, right? 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. So, and you look over there for a fraction of a second and nothing happens, then you're thinking, maybe that was an invalid cue or something. I don't know, but nothing happened. So your attention goes back to the center dot. And then maybe the X appears finally, but you're slow to detect it, right? Because you're slow to return your attention back to that left side if that's where the box was flashing. And so this is called inhibition of return, meaning that my ability to return my attention back to that previously cued location after it proved to be potentially invalid is now inhibited. But this doesn't happen so much with the endogenous cues. There are ways to induce inhibition of return with endogenous cues, but we see this effect much more strongly with the exogenous cues. So now this raises a bunch of questions, right? Why is the exogenous cue condition so much more likely to generate inhibition of return? So let's come to this point. Now, I said already the Posner queuing task doesn't seem like a real world task. But maybe this is where we can try to interpret the inhibition of return effect and connect it to a real world situation. So let's think, for example, about a situation where you are in a crowded environment. Thought I had this somewhere in my slide, um, and you're looking for a friend. Um, I thought for sure I had this written on the slide somewhere, but I'm not seeing it. Just my screen is partially blocked as well. Never mind. Let's just go with the example. So that's what we're doing, right? We're in a crowded environment, and I'm looking for someone. I'm looking for maybe my friend, who maybe I know that they're wearing a red shirt. So what's going to happen is if there's an exogenous cue, uh, that might mean that I saw something in my visual periphery that made me think somebody was over there wearing a red shirt. So I look over there, right? So that flash of color in my visual periphery is an exogenous cue, right? And it captures my attention. And I start to look over there and I'm like, nah, I don't see them. All right, it's not right. So I'm essentially treating that as now an invalid cue. And so I'm going to move my attention elsewhere. And now that I have done that, one thing that is kind of important here is that I do not need to waste any more time looking back over there, right? Because I've already looked over there and I determined my friend was not there. So whatever cue tempted me to look in that direction is over and done with, and I've already explored this area, so I'm going to shift my attention somewhere else, right? So that's what the inhibition of return does. It prevents us from wasting effort looking somewhere where we have already looked, right? So that's what the inhibition of return is. But why does this not happen for the endogenous cues, right? So the endogenous cue here, the arrow, the argument here is that this is more of a form of voluntary attention, whereas the exogenous cue is like this thing that captures your attention. It's involuntary, it's a little bit covert, right? But the endogenous cue now is an arrow that you have to interpret, right? You have to say, okay, the arrow is pointing to the left, so that means the target's going to be to the left. This gives you knowledge, right? It's not just something that captures your attention and sends you in that direction. It pulls you, right? That's what that red box turning on is. It just kind of pulls your attention to one side and gets you already looking over there. The arrow doesn't do that because the arrow is in the center. So that means you have to interpret it and make the voluntary choice to look in the direction the arrow is pointing, right? So now this becomes more of a top-down, voluntary, knowledge-driven process to look in the direction of the arrow. And in this case, what we find is that now what happens is that maybe the increased amount of resources involved in this task. And we can see, of course, if we do some neuroscience research, we can see that people have increased activation in their frontal lobes during the endogenous cue version of the task, suggesting, again, there's some interpretation and more voluntary attentional effort happening here. And this connects to real world stuff too, because I think in the previous video, I talked about looking for your phone, right? So let's say you have lost your phone. You can't remember where you placed your phone. You're walking around your house looking for it. And one thing that might happen is that out of the corner of your eye, you might see something that vaguely looks like your phone. So that could be an exogenous cue. You're going to look over there. You're going to rule out that area because, okay, that's not it. And then you're going to probably show inhibition of return, right? You're going to say, all right, I've already looked over there. I'm done with that. But on the other hand, something else might happen, right? So let's say you put your phone, you have a tendency to put your phone on a certain table by your front door, right? And you go, and so that would become more of an endogenous cue. It's a top-down process. You're going to say, I know that I usually put my phone over here on this table. So I'm going to go over here and look. And I go over there and look, and it's not there. And then I walk away and I start looking in other places. But one thing that sometimes might happen is that I start to convince myself, am I really sure that I didn't, put it on the table, right? And so you might actually go back and look again, right? Saying, I'm sure it must be here. I'm going to go look again. I already know I already looked, but I'm going to double check it, right? So that double checking is sometimes driven much more by a knowledge-driven process of I have yet to be convinced that it's not here, right? So that is the opposite of inhibition of return, right? We are in fact returning to the same location over and over again, double and triple checking to make sure we've really explored it correctly. But when this happens from an exogenous kind of a bottom-up cue, that's when we treat that more as a distraction. And so once we quickly attend to that distraction and rule it out, then we tend to just ignore it from there on out, right? So that's what's happening here. And that's kind of why the Posner queuing task is important. Let's do one more task here. Speaking of visual search, I think this kind of helps us wrap up the concept of what makes visual searches easy and difficult. That was kind of a theme we were dealing with here. So in a visual search task, again, I'm looking in a busy environment, a noisy, crowded, distracted environment, looking for some kind of a target. I'm looking for my lost cell phone in a house that's cluttered with lots of stuff. I'm looking for my friend in a room full of people, right? Or in the case of these studies, I'm looking for some shape or color on a screen, right? This is where Anne Treisman comes in. So in Treisman's research here, she presents first a theory of how attention works. So what happens in her theory, we'll say it's just her theory. It's got a long history in uh, um, theories of how visual perception are thought to work. It, in fact, goes back to John Locke. Um, but here the idea is that what happens is that in the earliest stages of vision, the visual system simply detects the presence of visual features in the environment. So what that means is that maybe at the level of the receptors, we are detecting the presence of uh, contrast in the environment, light areas, dark areas, bars and edges. Slightly higher in the visual system, also the presence of certain colors and maybe lines oriented in different directions. So we could say that all of these visual features, right, a line that's vertical or horizontal or leaning to the left or to the right a little, something red or blue or green, different little basic shapes, squares and circles and so forth. These are all features of objects, right? It's not the same as saying I'm seeing a phone or I'm seeing a person, but we're just describing some of the very basic kinds of attributes that visual objects can have. And so this feature detection process is something that's happening kind of passively, very quickly in the visual system. But the key word here is that it's parallel processing. So what does that mean? That means that all of the visual features coming in through your entire visual field are processed at the same time. Right? So that means that these processes are all happening simultaneously. That's what parallel processing means, is that it's all going side by side, right? But on the other hand, object recognition requires something else to happen. With objects, objects are not just a list of features. What we have to do is we have to focus our attention on an object. And then what happens is that its various features somehow bind together. This is called feature binding. And then when I see that, okay, I'm seeing an object that has the right shape, rectangle, it has the right size, has the right color, then I might say, that's my phone. But I don't recognize it as a phone until all of the relevant features have been attended to and bound together using attention. So Treisman describes attention as serving as something of a glue, right? It's attentional glue binds the features together here, and that's how we recognize the object. So the object is defined here as a conjunction of several different features. And so that's stage two. So stage one is that we are just receiving in parallel a bunch of perceptual information about what kinds of visual features are present. But then I can shift my attention from different regions of the visual field and bind things together at these local levels and perceive objects, right? But in order to perceive the object, I need to direct my attention directly towards them so that I can bind those features and see the thing and recognize the thing. In order to support the theory that perception and attention really work in these two stages and that attention is required for this kind of recognition, how do we test it? Well, this is where Treisman did visual search research. So what I have in the top left here is an example where we are doing a feature search. So the feature search is defined by the fact that the target, which is the red triangle, shares no features with the distractors, which are the blue squares. So that means its shape does not match the distractors and its color does not match the distractors. So what that means is that in order for me to confirm, that's my task, is this array of shapes appears on screen, and my task is to press a button to say the target is present, or a different button to say the target is absent. So it's basically a yes/no task. Yes, it's present. No, it's not. So if that red triangle is there, then that's all I got to do is say, uh, yes, it's there, right? And what we can see here is that it's gonna pop out, right? It's going to it doesn't matter if I'm attending to the colors or if I'm attending to the shapes. All I need to do is detect the presence of the appropriate feature, the color or the shape, and it's going to pop out. And I'm going to be very, very fast at saying, yes, the target is there. In other cases where the target might be absent, I'm going to be pretty fast at confirming its absence because the features that I'm looking for are also not there, right? One of the things that is manipulated in these kinds of studies is how many distractors there are, right? So just like we saw with that letter search task with covert attention earlier, uh, here's one where we could have only 3 or 4 blue squares, or maybe we could have 32 blue squares, right? And for the feature search, as it turns out, it doesn't even matter, right? If there's just a couple of distractors or if there's 30 distractors, we are equally fast at detecting the presence or absence of the target. So that's all considered to be evidence of a parallel process here, because that's all you need to do is detect the feature. You don't need to recognize an object. You just need to know about the presence or absence of a feature. This happens as a parallel process, right? All of the features are processed simultaneously, so it doesn't matter how many features need to be processed, just a few or a whole screen full. But on the right-hand side, we have the conjunction search. So our target is still the red triangle, but now our distractors are, well, some blue squares, but we also have some red squares, so that they contain one overlapping feature with the target, the color red. We also have some blue triangles, so they also share a feature with our red triangle target. So in order to confirm the target is really there, I have to look at it, right? I have to start scanning and looking at every single object. Is that a red triangle? No. Is that a red triangle? No. Is that a red triangle? No. Is that a red triangle? Oh, yes. That's it, right? And as soon as I find it, then I can confirm and say, yep, that's the red triangle. So I press the button to say yes. Alternatively, I might just keep scanning and scanning and scanning and scanning until I have convinced myself I've looked at every single one of these things and I have ruled them all out so I can say no. So what does this tell us? This tells us that in a conjunction search, it does require uh, uh, attention, right? I have to look at something and bind the features and determine what the object is, and I can only do this one at a time. I have to scan each object until I find the target and say yes, or until I've searched everywhere, and then I say no. So as you would imagine, then reaction times in the conjunction search are quite a bit slower because now I really do have to scan and look and confirm what I'm seeing. Also, the number of distractors matters because if there's only 3 or 4 distractors, then that means there's only 3 or 4 things I've got to look at before I can determine what the answer is. But as shown here, if there's 32 things on screen, I've got 32 things I'm going to potentially have to look at before I can give an answer, right? So we would expect reaction times to increase as a function of how many distractors there are, but only for the conjunction search, not for the feature search. And I have a graph here. So let me jump ahead real quick because that's what we are looking at right here. Display size is the name for the total number of distractors that are present. So in this particular experiment that was done, the number of distractors was either 4, 16, or 64. The 2 lines at the bottom are called the feature searches, right? So that was the target was defined simply by the presence of a certain feature. And we see the lines are flat. So even as we increase the total number of distractors, the reaction time is flat, doesn't increase. We also note, of course, that these are faster than the other searches, all right, the conjunction searches. Right, the mean reaction time is down around 650 or so milliseconds there. Also, the feature absent and feature present conditions have essentially the same reaction time, right? Those lines are right on top of each other. But let's look at the conjunction trials, right? What happens here is that for the conjunction present, that means the target's really there. It takes more time to respond as the total number of distractors goes up. For the conjunction absent, that's also true. As we increase the distractors, the reaction time goes up. But why are they different from each other? Why is it that the conjunction present is a little faster than the conjunction absent? Well, it's kind of related to how I described your strategy here. If the target's there, I'm going to start searching, and there's a good chance I'm going to find the target. Let's say in this case where there's 64 distractors, there's a fairly good chance that I'm going to find the target before I have had to search all 64 of these things, right? So that means that I might find it halfway through, right? So I've only searched 30 out of the 64, but I found it, so I can press the button, right? I don't have to keep going anymore. But on a target absent case, I do have to keep going, right? I have to scan every single target before I can finally rule it out. So in these conjunction absent trials, people are spending a long time having to serially scan and attend to every single element on screen, whereas in the conjunction present trials, on average, they find it about halfway through the scanning process, right? That's what I have described on this previous slide that I skipped over now just broken out into words. So again, for the feature task, reaction times are faster. Reaction time increases with the number of distractors only for conjunction searches. The effect of the target present versus absent manipulation also is only showing up for the conjunction searches. So our conclusions here is that this is evidence that feature searches occur fast and parallel, right? Everything gets processed all at once. The conjunction searches are serial, right? Because a serial search means I have to look at one thing, then another, and then another in a series or in a sequence. So that's a serial process. But it's also what's known as a self-terminating search. And so let's think about what this term means. A self-terminating search means that I'm searching until I find the target. And so I'm not exhaustively searching, except in those cases where the target is absent. So in an exhaustive search, I would need to look at every single thing on screen, and then I could say no, right? But in a self-terminating search, if I find the target early, right, when I've only, maybe sometimes I find it right off the bat, right? Sometimes I might have to do a little bit of scanning, but I find it, right? So at this point, I can stop the search. That's what we mean by self-terminating, right? The search automatically stops once I found the target. It wouldn't make any sense to have an exhaustive search in those cases, right? That to say, okay, I'm looking for the target, there it is, but I'm going to keep going and look at the rest anyway. That's what an exhaustive search would be. Why would we do such a thing? Of course, we would not do such a thing. But there are other kinds of cognitive tasks that can show the existence of certain kinds of serial exhaustive searches. We're not going to cover that in this context, though. So for now, we could say that we have concluded that feature searches are easy because it's a low perceptual demand. Parallel processing is involved. Conjunction searches require a little bit more attentional effort, so that makes them more difficult, much more loaded by distraction. So we can quantify the effect of distraction here as well. And this can show us some things about how to measure attentional load. Related then to the issue of attentional load and conjunction searches is that they do require that kind of fixation, and much more difficult when there's distraction going on, right? And another form of distraction is what's called visual crowding. So here your task is to determine whether the letter A is present. So you're going to keep your eyes fixed at the green dot in the center of our stimulus, and then something might appear on the left or on the right. And if it's the letter A, you should say yes, right, by pressing a button. When it appears all by itself, as it does on the left, you're going to be pretty quick and accurate here. But in the case where it's surrounded by a bunch of other similar looking distractors here, lots of overlapping features perhaps, you're going to really have to find a way to dig in through that crowd of distractors and find the letter A. Now, if we move those distractors kind of away, right, we space it all out a little bit so that it's not all crowded, this effect gets weaker and weaker. But when it's really super crowded, it gets harder and harder to recognize the A correctly. So you're a lot slower. Your reaction time is slower. Here, I'm just throwing in a real world example at the bottom, right? You're driving. You want one thing that you want to watch out for would be maybe a child playing on the side of the road where they're not supposed to be, of course. And on the left, we can see how it would be pretty easy to notice them and respond as needed. But on the right, the child is visually crowded by these signs, and that's going to maybe make it harder. And we can draw maybe a much more direct real world example because hopefully we don't encounter lots of children playing on the side of the road when we're driving around, but we do probably drive through construction zones quite a bit where you have construction workers on the side of the road. So being able to note their presence or absence and recognize who they are and where they are and what they're doing and if they're walking a certain direction, it's all pretty critical information. And visual crowding effects could definitely impact that. And that, as we say, is that. So I think that's enough for this particular topic. We have some more notes to cover in this chapter, but the video here will suffice until next time. Okay.